Over 150 years ago, a soldier from the southern United States named Albert Pike wrote a letter which predicted the First, the Second, and the Third World War in unbelievably accurate detail. The authenticity of this letter hasn't been confirmed, and it's quite possible that it is just a hoax. However, predicting global conflicts isn't that unprecedented when you know how they happen. Today, a Third World War seems closer than ever, and some would argue that we're in it already. This has everyone wondering what could happen and what they should do. My name is Jessica, and you're watching Coin Bureau, and stay tuned to find out. I'll start by saying that lots of the information in this video is speculative. That's simply because it involves lots of political and geopolitical events taking place. The former are difficult to predict, and the latter are probably impossible to predict. That said, all of this speculative information is based on the best facts that we have. Now, before we unpack everything that has been going on, it's necessary to understand what a world war is. Historically speaking, world wars consist of two groups of countries that were geopolitically aligned, fighting each other. The easiest example here is the Axis and the Allies during the Second World War. Perhaps we're mistaken, but it appears that this kind of world war is no longer possible. Once upon a time, governments could use propaganda to convince their citizens to fight and die in the name of their king or country. In the modern day, the free flow of information has made this propaganda ineffective. This is especially true when it comes to convincing the average person to fight and die in an overseas country that they've never heard of and probably couldn't find on a map. For example, most Americans were firmly opposed to sending US soldiers to Ukraine, but they did support helping Ukraine in every other way. Again, that's because the average person is informed enough to know that going to a war is almost never in their interests and only ever benefits governments, mega banks, global corporations, and, of course, weapon manufacturers. There seems to be one exception, however, and that's wars between neighbouring countries. If you look at the conflicts that have arisen around the world, you'll notice that they all have one thing in common. They're all regional, and they all have territory that's been disputed for years, if not decades. You'll also notice that there have been conflicts in these regions for just as long, and they've just escalated in recent years. Now, while it's almost impossible to convince the average person to fight for foreign power for reasons they don't understand or don't care about, it's really easy to convince the average person to fight a neighbour that's been terrorising and killing their friends, their family, and fellow citizens for as long as they've been alive. Although some of these regional conflicts seem to involve countries that are geopolitical opponents, many involve countries that are technically geopolitical allies. The example that comes to mind here is the border dispute between China and India, which could easily become another regional flashpoint. For context, China and India are both part of BRICS, an expanding alliance of African, Middle Eastern, South American, and Asian countries that are supposed to be opposed to the Western world order led by the US and its allies. And yet, there is significant tensions within both geopolitically aligned groups. More about the BRICS is in the description, but getting back to the topic that's at hand. What this means is that the world war we're likely to see, or that we could already be in, is probably not going to look like the world wars that we've had in the past. It's probably not going to be one geopolitical side versus the other. It's going to be multiple regional conflicts around the world that are slowly turning into full-blown wars. On the one hand, this means that the loss of human life will likely be lower, and the use of world-ending weapons is likely off the table. We hope so anyway. On the other hand, multiple regional conflicts and tensions between geopolitical allies could result in significantly more economic and social disruption. If you're finding this video useful so far, be sure to smash that like button and give it a boost. Now, this begs the question of what's causing all of these regional conflicts to escalate into full-blown wars. The answer depends on how closely you're analysing them. Up close, it looks like a series of events that led up to this escalation. This is what everyone argues about when it comes to these conflicts. If you zoom out, however, it looks like these regional conflicts are escalating because of something they all have in common. Their economies are not looking good, and the people are upset with the rulers. For reference, it's well known that going into war is one way to restore order when there is social unrest. This makes sense considering that going to war makes it possible to direct the rage of the population to individuals and institutions in other countries. Going to war also makes it possible for domestic powers to blame all of the economic and social issues on the foreign powers they want the population to fight. If you look at all of the regional conflicts that have erupted in recent months, you'll be shocked at how accurate that is. Public approval of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and also Russian President Vladimir Putin was plummeting until the war began. After that, their approvals spiked back up. Similarly, public approval of Hamas among Palestinians has only ever increased when there was conflict in Israel. On the Israeli side, Benjamin Netanyahu was famously facing mass protests before the recent escalation. Unfortunately for him, the escalation seems to have hurt, not helped, his public approval. On that note, escalation of regional conflicts in recent months have led to speculation that China and Taiwan are next in line. This would not be surprising, considering that the Chinese economy is reportedly imploding. Believe it or not, but the public support for Taiwan's president has been falling off a cliff too. Obviously, it's impossible to know how the average citizen feels about their leader in a country like China, but the fact that there has been unprecedented protests in recent months suggests that it's not looking good. Now consider that having high youth unemployment has historically been a high risk factor for revolution. If you live in the US or the EU, you'll know that the economies have also been struggling and the politicians in power are also extremely unpopular. The difference is that they don't have neighbouring countries to use as scapegoats, and attempts to blame faraway countries have reportedly failed. Speaking of which, it's important to remember that all of these regional conflicts aren't occurring in a vacuum. They're taking place against the backdrop of a much larger geopolitical shift, specifically the gradual decline of a US-led world order and the apparent rise of a Chinese-led world order. This context has led many to argue that all of the regional conflicts are actually proxy wars between the US and China. This argument makes sense when you realize the US has been providing significant military and financial support to one side, and China has been doing the same for the other. However, others would argue these regional conflicts were inevitable due to more fundamental economic and social reasons that I've just outlined. The US and China may just be using them as an opportunity to move their pieces on the chessboard strategically in regions. If this is the case, then it is possible that we'll see more regional conflicts escalate, and it's likely that not all of them will involve the US or China. After all, there are limited resources to send around. The US and China will likely direct these resources to the regional conflicts that matter the most to them.
We interrupt this programme for an emergency crypto weather forecast. Get ready for a whirlwind of savings. We're seeing some high-pressure sign-up bonus systems forming in the northeast, with some exchanges offering up to $40,000. In the south, we'll be seeing some heavy discounts on hardware wallets, so watch out for those if you're going to be out and about. And then in central areas, there's a high chance of trading P discounts, which should be settling in later on, so be on the lookout for up to 60% off there. Lush! For a more comprehensive forecast, just visit coinmeter.com/deals or use the link down in the description. These deals are red hot, so make sure to take all the necessary precautions. Well, that's all for today's forecast. Now back to the scheduled programme.
This ties into the economic and social impacts these regional conflicts could have. These impacts ultimately depend on the political and geopolitical responses to them. As I mentioned earlier, it's impossible to predict these responses, but we can get a sense of the direction by zooming out. At the end of the day, what people will need is affordable food, water, shelter, and a reasonable degree of safety. This requires a lot of energy, commodities, and a decent amount of domestic security. Notably, domestic security includes border security, without which shelter and safety can come under threat. Recent events that we have seen suggests that regional conflicts have an impact on these factors, even when they're not local. Given these facts, you can divide countries into two categories: those that have resources required to ensure their citizens have affordable food, water, shelter, and security, and those that don't. Logically, countries which have lots of these resources will likely experience small social and economic impacts. By contrast, countries which don't have these resources will likely experience large social and economic impacts. Let's call the former independent countries and the latter dependent countries. To minimize economic and social impacts, governments of dependent countries will have to have a political, aka a domestic response, as well as a geopolitical, aka an international response. Of course, these are often intertwined, which makes things complicated. Even then, you can simplify it when you realize that most of the world's resources are priced in US dollars. It means that there are only two possible political and geopolitical responses by governments in dependent countries. Either they work to maximize their access to resources, or they work to maximize their access to US dollars. Domestically, this means either exploiting existing resources or restricting the use of resources. Geopolitically, this means either aligning with countries that have lots of resources, namely China and the other BRICS, or aligning with countries that have lots of US dollars, namely the US and its allies. If a dependent country decides to exploit its existing resources, then it reduces the need to align geopolitically with either of the two superpowers. Conversely, if a dependent country decides to restrict its use of resources, then it increases the need to align geopolitically with one of these two superpowers. Right now, it seems that many dependent countries are deciding to restrict the use of their resources, which is forcing them to align geopolitically with one of the superpowers. The elephant in the room is the EU. It has been restricting its resource use for environmental reasons, and it's been aligning with the US as a result. This is fine, but the way it's been done risks undermining things that the Europeans need to be satisfied with: affordable food, water, shelter, and a reasonable degree of safety. The last one has been front and centre in recent months, with previously pro-immigration countries pulling a full 180 to preserve order. Meanwhile, some EU countries have aligned with China due to their push for renewable energy. The practical effect of this is that it risks pulling the Union apart. The countries that have the most dependence will either violate the EU's restrictions on resources or separate into blocs aligned with the US or with China. Some version of this is happening in every country and region around the world. Where it's not possible for countries to push blame onto their neighbours, there will be a risk of significant civil unrest. For dependent countries that have no resources left to exploit, the only solution is geopolitical alignment. This relates to the possibility that we could see a global situation escalate into another world war. An actual world war, not just a collection of regional conflicts. This has to do with the geopolitical backdrop that I mentioned earlier, the decline of the US world order and the rise of the Chinese world order. To quickly recap, independent countries will be mostly insulated from the effects of regional conflicts, where dependent countries will have to either exploit their resources, if available, or align geopolitically with independent countries aligned with the US or those aligned with China. In theory, this means that dependent countries which are forced to align with the US or China will be forced to do fighting in a new world war if it occurs. In practice, however, you will recall that it's going to be really difficult to convince these dependent countries to fight in the absence of existing regional conflicts. If this is the case, then it does suggest that if a new world war, if it happens, would occur between two independent countries, namely the US and China. What's interesting is that the mainstream definition of World War III appears to involve exactly that, a direct, kinetic war between the US and China. However, it's likewise going to be really difficult to convince the average person in the US and China to fight. In fact, it could be even more difficult because, unlike dependent countries, independent countries won't have the same degree of economic and social issues. This will make it harder to rally people to war. Not only that, but independent countries like the US and China are more likely to have nukes, which makes a direct kinetic conflict exponentially riskier and undesirable. This is why the US will reportedly bomb Taiwan to destroy its military microchip facilities rather than defend in a regional conflict with China. It's also why the geopolitical conflict between the US and China has been almost exclusively economic, and why it will likely stay that way. Fortunately for us, an economic war is much more painful for the people in power in independent countries. This means we probably won't be sent to the front lines. Unfortunately for us, an economic war risks introducing the social unrest that sets the stage for a kinetic conflict between these two superpowers. This is the outcome that has everyone worried, but they seem to be forgetting a critical component: all of those dependent countries around the world. These dependent countries have made it possible for the US and China to minimize the social and economic impacts of their economic war, at least for now. These so-called friendshoring is slowly but surely creating a so-called bipolar world, a mostly peaceful separation, but not a head-to-head battle. As such, you could say that all of these supposed proxy wars we've seen over the last couple of years have been part of a process to establish where borders are in this new bipolar world. If so, then there may be a few more of them, but they're unlikely to escalate to the point that the planet explodes. In fact, you could go as far as to argue that in the interest of dependent and independent countries, that these regional conflicts remain contained. Too much escalation would lead to too much economic and social disruption in too short of a time. It would result in the people in power being overthrown. Come to think of it, this is probably why world leaders have been flying to all of these regional conflict zones and inviting delegates from involved parties to visit their respective capital cities. They are there to ensure these things don't get out of control, and their physical presence effectively ensures that they won't. This brings us to the big question, and that's what you should do about all of the information above. For starters, you need to identify if you're in a country that could be part of a regional conflict. If you are, then you might want to try and move somewhere else, or at least have a plan in case it gets to that point. If you're not in a country that could be part of a regional conflict, then you need to assess if your country is dependent or independent. To refresh your memory, this means assessing if your country has the resources that it needs to ensure its citizens have affordable food, water, shelter, and enough security. For reference, the countries with the most self-sufficient for food are Argentina, Uruguay, Australia, Ukraine, New Zealand, Canada, Bulgaria, Hungary, Lithuania, and Malaysia. If you live in these countries or a country that's close to them, the chances are you live in an independent country. By contrast, if you live near Norway, Belgium, Haiti, Somalia, the Dominican Republic, Zimbabwe, Armenia, the Netherlands, Panama, or Syria, the chances are that you live in a dependent country. The issue is that many of these dependent countries have access to enough resources to almost be independent. If you live in a dependent country that doesn't have these resources, then you need to ask yourself which geopolitical team it's playing on, the US or China. At that point, you need to ask yourself which side of the bipolar world you'd like to live in. Ideally, you'd want to have the ability to have a foot in both. That's because there is no predicting how the politics or geopolitics of these poles will evolve. Perhaps the US side is the place to be today, but will it be the place to be tomorrow? If the US is truly on the decline and China is on the rise, then it's possible that the Chinese side will improve as time goes on. This sounds crazy right now, but you must remember to think about the trajectory of the countries involved, including yours. In many Western countries, the standard of living for the average person is high, but there is many metrics to suggest that it's slowly on the decline. Conversely, in many Eastern countries, the standard of living for the average person is low, but there are many metrics to suggest that it's rapidly on the rise. Again, there is no predicting how the politics or geopolitics of these countries will evolve, but you want to keep your options open as much as possible. More importantly, you need to factor in your future plans. Getting a 30-year mortgage in a dependent country that is the risk of a regional conflict is probably not a wise decision. On the flip side, buying a cheap property in an independent country that's growing from this alignment is very wise. If you're wondering how long this period of global uncertainty will last, the answer seems to be another 10 to 20 years. That's because of the economic issues that are driving so much of this global uncertainty have their roots in the current financial system, which itself has its roots in the reserve currency, the US dollar. To put things into perspective, reserve currencies last for around 100 years. Given that the US dollar became the world's reserve currency in the 1940s, that means they're nearer the tail end of the US dollar's reign. With all of the previous changes in reserve currencies, this entails a prolonged period of instability. Once that period is over, a new reserve currency will be adopted, and the world will have a new stable base for which it can grow. Between now and then, there will be lots of chaos, but also lots of opportunity. If you pay attention and plan accordingly, the 10 to 20 years after that could be the best years of your life. As a wise man once said, "Don't be scared, be prepared. If you are, then everything will be all right." That's all for today's video. If you found it informative, smash that like button to let us know. If you want to stay informed, be sure to subscribe to the channel and ping that notification bell. If you want to help others stay informed, take a second to share this video with your friends and family. If you happen to be into crypto, you need to check out the Coin Bureau Deals page. It's got up to $40,000 of bonuses on some of the best crypto exchanges, along with the biggest trading fee discounts. It's even got the biggest discounts on the best hardware wallets. The link will be in the description. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.